why it was needed. For those of you unaware, the Patriot Act stands for Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. The Patriot Act was needed after President George W. Bush declared war on terror. After war was declared, the Senate started working on legislation that would give all law enforcement the tools and power needed to fight terrorism. The Patriot Act was created in response to the September 11th attacks. After the attacks on 9/11, Congress decided to make a new law that would help protect the American people from future attacks. Shortly after the attacks, the Patriot Act was signed into law on October 26, 2001.
How it works. Allows agents to follow sophisticated terrorists trained to evade detection. Law enforcement has been able to use roving wiretaps because international terrorists are trained and sophisticated by changing location and communication. This act allows agents to seek court supervision to use the same techniques. Allows law enforcement to conduct investigations without tipping off terrorists. Law enforcement delays the time to tell the subject about the search warrant. Notice is always provided, but delaying the time to inform them will make it harder to flee. Protects civil liberties and provides for the common defense. The Constitution requires the President and Congress to respect and defend individual civil liberties and provide for the common defense.
The Patriot Act also allows investigators to use the tools that were already available to investigate organized crime and drug trafficking. This helped expand the National Electronic Crime Task Force, allowing investigators to use electronic surveillance to monitor the movement and actions of organized crime and drug trafficking. It also facilitated information sharing, the cooperation among government agencies so that they can better connect the dots. By allowing the sharing of information, agencies are better able to build cases and investigate the situation much more thoroughly. It also updated the law to reflect new technologies and new threats. With the new technology and everyone posting to online social media sites, the law had to be updated to be able to include the searches of said media sites to better prevent crime and attacks. It also helps with the ability to track cyber attacks such as hacking. The Patriot Act also increased the penalties for those who committed terrorist crimes. These increased penalties in prison time help prevent people from even attempting terrorist crimes and therefore help prevent the devastation of these terrorist attacks.
There are 10 titles under the Patriot Act. Title I of the Patriot Act helps protect the civil liberties of American citizens and allows for the Secret Service to form a specific task force. It also condemns discrimination against Arab and Muslim Americans. This title also increases funding for technical support of the FBI and allows greater authority for the President in cases of terrorism. Title II is Enhanced Surveillance Procedures, which increases interception of communication in many areas. There are more areas the government can keep eyes on and also allows them to communicate with other agencies such as phone, internet, and cable companies to gain and share information in cases of terrorism. Title III is about handling the money involved with terrorism and cutting off their flow of financial support. It allows for an increase in information to be released from banks and also for longer prison times for money laundering and smuggling and financing terrorism. This title also increased record-keeping and reporting requirements for the banks. This title also deals with quadrupling the maximum penalty for counterfeiting foreign currency. Title IV is focused on protecting the border and strengthening border security. It increases funding for border control, customs, immigration regulations, and more investigative powers to law enforcement in this area. Overall, the goal is to increase the difficulty of entering the country for those known to have or suspected of having terrorist intent. Title V is removing obstacles to investigating terrorism. This includes allowing the release of information of those under investigation. This also gives the Attorney General funds to use as rewards for identification of any known key leaders of terrorist organizations. This section of the Patriot Act also amends the DNA Analysis Backlog Elimination Act so that it could include the collection and analysis of DNA of those convicted with terrorism and crimes of violence. Finally, this title allows for federal officers to coordinate efforts to investigate or protect against the possibility of an attack or sabotage using an intelligence service or network of foreign power.
Title VI. Providing for victims of terrorism, public safety officers, and their families. Federal law authorizes benefits to families who are victimized by the death or catastrophic injury of a public safety officer in the line of duty. Payments are due no later than 30 days after if injury was related to a terrorist attack. Benefits were increased from $100,000 to $250,000 after 9/11. Victims of Crime Act of 1984 now reads, the director may set aside up to $50 million from the amount transferred to the fund in response to the airplane hijackings and terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001. Title VII, Increased Information Sharing for Critical Infrastructure Protection, amends the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968. Allows the Director of the Office of Justice Programs to make grants and enter into contracts with law enforcement agencies and some organizations to deal with terrorist groups that cross jurisdictional boundaries. Gives directors a budget of $50 million to fiscal year 2002 and $100 million to fiscal year 2003 to be used to establish and operate a secure information sharing system to combat terrorist activities. Title VIII, Strengthening the Criminal Laws Against Terrorism, creates a definition of terrorism, adds several crimes to the list of things considered terrorism, such as attacking a mass transit system, using a biological weapon, supporting terrorism, and computer hacking. The penalty for terrorist crimes are also increased. Title IX, Improved Intelligence. It amends the National Security Act of 1947, states that only the President or the Attorney General may authorize application for a FISA surveillance or physical search code, creates a method for the sharing of national intelligence information between government agencies. The Attorney General is directed to develop guidelines to ensure the dissemination to the intelligence community of foreign intelligence information learned during a criminal investigation. Title X, Miscellaneous, contains a number of small provisions that don't fall under any other titles. It contains 16 sections. Some examples are definition of electronic surveillance, venue and money laundering cases, First Responders Assistance Act, authorization of funds for DEA police training in South and Central Asia.
In 2010, President Barack Obama signed a one-year extension of 3 sections of the Patriot Act. These 3 sections allow wiretapping, seizure of suspects' records without their knowledge, and surveillance of so-called lone wolf or someone deemed suspicious but without any known ties to an organized terrorist group. On May 16, 2011, Congress passed a 4-year extension of the Patriot Act and was signed by President Obama. The extension leaves Section 215, also known as the Library Records Provision, unchanged. This allows the FBI to ask a federal court for access to any tangible thing, including library records, relevant to a terrorist threat. The Patriot Act expired in May of 2015 and was renewed as the USA Freedom Act in June.
When the Patriot Act expired on June 1st, 2015, the new Freedom Act was passed on June 2nd of 2015. And the Freedom Act was very similar to the Patriot Act, except it was intended to fix many parts of the Patriot Act that were controversial. But there are still 3 parts that expired the day before that are now restored, which includes Section 215, which previously allowed government to collect metadata, which is like phone calls, phone numbers, and like what time something was sent and like other stuff like that. But now it just can't be collected in bulk, so it's very similar, but not exactly. The lone wolf, which allows electronic surveillance of a person that is not connected to any terrorist group, which like it allows them to track someone and see what they're up to, but even if they're not in a terrorist group, but they're like acting on their own. The roving wiretap allows the NSA to track people on different devices without consent, and that's like people like you and me that we don't need to get, like we are, like the government is allowed to look at our phones and stuff without consent. And these things are set to expire in 2019.